Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with Mr. Snyder. Today we are going to finish up the 1970s by talking about the presidencies of Ford and Carter. So Watergate takes place during the decade that witnesses significant social, economic, and cultural changes. This growing sense among Americans is that something had gone wrong during the 60s and 70s, and that the nation had gotten off the right track. It's even a sense of the nation's political dialogue today. And so let's take a look into this a little bit further. Gerald Ford becomes president after Nixon resigns. And so on September 8th, 1974, less than a month later, he pardons Nixon for any crimes he committed as president. This was highly controversial. Critics of it say that it was a quid pro quo, like a secret deal was made because Ford would get to become president and Nixon would have any wrongdoing against him pardoned. This destroys Ford's credibility right out of the gate. It's the number one reason he ends up losing the 1976 election, and there are two assassination attempts made against him in his little over 2 years as president, one by a follower of Charles Manson. So stagflation is still a problem. Nixon couldn't control it. Remember, stagflation is rising prices and rising unemployment. We have double-digit inflation in 1974 and 75, where the normal inflation, a healthy amount of inflation, is 3%. Ford tries to combat this by instituting a mostly volunteer program known as WIN, or WHIP inflation now, and it's an absolute failure. So stagflation remains a problem. As far as Ford and foreign policy goes, he continues to pursue détente with the Soviet Union and China. He and the head of the Soviet Union, Leonid Brezhnev, endorsed the Helsinki Accords, which put every European nation in favor of human rights. And we acknowledge that there are such things as human rights, or basic rights entitled to every human. Although Ford endorses this, Ford actually puts arms control as more of a priority ahead of human rights during his short presidency. Jimmy Carter will be the exact opposite. He'll put human rights ahead of arms control. There is a Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty 2 that is signed between the Soviet Union and the United States. It agrees to limit nuclear production of nuclear missiles, and it basically it is signed and we bring it back to the United States, but it won't get ratified, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Foreign policy in Southeast Asia, you saw he doesn't want to get involved because the Khmer Rouge government in Cambodia is killing 1.5 million people between 1975 and 1979, a mass genocide. We don't want to intervene. We don't want to get involved. We want to put the turmoil of Southeast Asia and Vietnam behind us. The one time we do get involved is in May 1976 or 1975 when they seize an American merchant ship. Ford does send in the Marines to take back the ship, and they successfully do so. In 1975, on Ford's watch, South Vietnam does fall to communism, and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese, some who worked with the United States, try to escape the country because they don't want to end up like their Cambodian counterparts. And they try to escape in rickety boats, and these are called boat people. This is the largest mass migration of humanity by sea in human history. Over the next 20 years, more than 1 million move to other Southeast Asian nations. Some come to Canada and eventually the United States as well. Fort Wayne has a very large Burmese population because of some uprisings in the late 80s in Burma, and so they moved to the United States as well, but this was first in the 1970s. In 1976, Gerald Ford comes up against Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter, a relative unknown. Nobody's ever heard of Jimmy Carter, but he becomes popular. He wins the Democratic nomination. Ford is president during the United States bicentennial celebration in 1976, bi meaning 2, centennial meaning 100, so our 200th birthday. Ford has the large disadvantage of being seen as too close to the discredited Nixon administration as well. So Jimmy Carter does win. He becomes president. our 39th president. You don't have to write these down, but just some cool facts. He's a Korean War veteran, the only one ever to serve as president. He's the first president from the Deep South since the Civil War. He was the first president born in a hospital, and he was a peanut farmer for a living before getting into politics in Georgia there. He wins the election because of the support of Christian fundamentalists who get increasingly involved in politics in the 1970s. And Christian fundamentalists are those who support a strict literal interpretation of the Bible. But unfortunately, Carter's inexperience does him in. He doesn't have any relationships with anybody in Washington, which is seen as an advantage to voters, but it also does not help him get any of his major bills passed. One controversial thing he does is he does grant amnesty to draft dodgers during Vietnam. So the people who left the country or refused to fight for their country, some of them were seen as cowards by some people, he forgave them for not fighting. And he thought this would help the nation move on, but instead he was criticized for forgiving those people who refused to fight. Stagflation keeps eating away at people's savings. The U.S. automobile industry in the late 70s also has an issue because they have serious competition with Japan. Japan introduces cars that are cheaper and made better. And in 1980, Chrysler actually needs a $1.5 billion bailout from the U.S. government, a loan so that they could stay in business. GM also needed one in the late 2000, 2008, 2009, somewhere around there, but that's not the first time this happened. There's also an oil crisis going on. We talked last time about the Yom Kippur War in the Arab nations. So these are just some stats saying that, we dropped from 1.2 million barrels being imported per day to 19,000 barrels per day. Gas rises from 33 cents to 55 cents a gallon in just over a year in 1973. Long lines develop at gas stations because of reduced supply, and there's a national maximum speed limit enforced. Even on the interstates, you cannot go higher than 55 miles an hour because that was deemed the most efficient speed limit. If you went higher, you were just wasting gas because of air friction and stuff like that. Here you can see, I'll give you a quick lesson in economics. Nominal means the price that it was at the time, and real means how much it cost in 2011 dollars. So you can see this is the dollars per barrel. So during the Civil War, you can see we have some spikes in the late 1800s. World War II didn't do that much to it, but then during the 1970s, you can see the price goes up, and then it finally, this data ends in 2011, around $115 per barrel. Other weird things from the oil crisis, don't feel like you need to write these down, but schools, offices, and factories would all periodically close down during the winter to conserve heating oil. Government enacts laws during this time to force automakers to make more fuel-efficient cars and smaller cars, so this ends the era of the huge boats that you saw. Auto racing, if you're an auto racing fan, also cut back. 24 Hours of Daytona was canceled. NASCAR reduces all their race lengths, and Indy 500, qualifying was reduced from 4 days to 2. Here are some of Jimmy Carter's policies to try to combat this: passing the National Energy Act, which had a wide-ranging effect of taxing gas-guzzling cars, removing price controls on oil, and extending tax credits to alternative energy development. The Community Reinvestment Act is hoping to sort of help these urban areas sort of make themselves better. It requires banks to make loans in the same neighborhood from which they take deposits. And Paul Volcker becomes the chair of the Federal Reserve Board. He raises interest rates, and long term this causes inflation to fall, but it does not solve inflation in the short term. You can see by the end of Carter's presidency, it's at 14%. Here's some pictures from the oil crisis. You can see long lines. Some states had vouchers, color systems. And then we get to the Soviet-Afghan War. And this is really what ends détente between the Soviet Union and the United States. Afghanistan is run by a pro-Soviet communist government. There's a Muslim rebel group there called the Mujahideen that is intent on overthrowing the government, so the Soviets invade Afghanistan to crush the rebellion. The Soviets, they outmatch the Afghanis in every way. The rebels, however, use guerrilla fighting tactics and knowledge of their mountainous terrain, which kind of sounds like our Vietnam. You could consider this the Soviets' Vietnam. After thousands of casualties, the Soviets pull out in 1989. Rival Muslim factions fight over Afghanistan until the Taliban takes over and imposes harsh rule on its citizens. During this war, we tried to discredit the Soviets, and we used the CIA to supply the rebels with weapons and terrorist training. Some of these rebels later on, Osama bin Laden becomes one of their leaders, turns on the United States, and they use these weapons and terrorist tactics against the United States. They bomb the World Trade Center first in 1993. They bomb our embassies in 1998. They attack a U.S. warship off the coast of Yemen in 2000, and then finally the September 11th attacks of 2001. So this stuff is all connected, and I just sort of wanted to give you a look at that because we are going to be studying it later on. Carter's foreign policy, though, focuses on human rights more than arms control, like we said. But when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, Carter responded with sanctions or penalties, economic penalties against the Soviets. One of these included a U.S. boycott of the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow, and the Soviets returned in favor in 1984 by boycotting the Summer Olympics in Los Angeles. So the U.S. is angry about this invasion. They refuse to fight for this treaty in the Senate, and the U.S. never ratifies SALT II, never becomes law. Here's some other sanctions, basically pulling out our grain, a grain embargo, recalling our U.S. ambassador from the Soviet Union, increasing our aid to the resistance fighters. So those are the sanctions against the Soviet Union. Again, human rights. One specific place with Carter and human rights is in Nicaragua, where their dictator is brutal towards their citizens. So even though he is anti-communist and we're helping him, since he's brutal towards his citizens, Carter reverses policy and is not going to do business with him. He has to flee, and the communist Sandinista party comes into power, and that will come into play during Reagan's administration in the 1980s. Carter's foreign policy events, the Mariel boat lift out of Cuba. In 1980, Castro announces that any Cuban can leave Cuba for the United States, but they would also have to take Cuban prisoners with them. And this leaves a lot of Cubans to come to Cuba from the United States from Cuba, even though the Americans are fearful that a lot of these immigrants have spent time in prison, even though that's not true. And then finally, we give control of the Panama Canal back to Panama. We've controlled it since 1903. We've paid rent, so to speak, to use it. But Carter negotiates to give it back to Panama by 1999. It's controversial because many Americans feel it would jeopardize our access to world shipping. Two other foreign policy events in Carter's presidency are the Camp David Accords. Remember the Yom Kippur War in 1973? It's the fourth war between Egypt and Israel in 25 years. Their whole beef is that Egypt is Arab and Israel is Jewish. So the two leaders meet at Camp David with Jimmy Carter to try to improve the relations. Jimmy Carter is a kind of a born-again Christian. He knows his biblical history, so he tries to iron out something. And they finally get an agreement called the Camp David Accords to Egypt formally recognize Israel. They're the first Arab nation to do this. And Israel removes troops from the occupied territory of Egypt. So two different things happening there on the road to peace. And then finally we get to the Iranian hostage crisis, which happens from 1979 until President Reagan is sworn in on January 20th, 1981, and it ends up being 444 days. What happens? There's 52 U.S. diplomats, or people who work on behalf of the United States in another country, are held hostage at the U.S. Embassy in Iran. So going back a little bit in the history, you don't necessarily have to know all of this, but the CIA sponsors a coup d'etat to throw out the governor of Iran. We've talked about this with Eisenhower. And we put someone who is friendly to the United States in charge of Iran, even though he is horrible and treats his citizens very oppressively. He also exiles or kicks out of the country the leader of the opposition in 1964. Later on, during the Iranian Revolution of 1977 and 78, the Shah's regime falls and he goes into exile, and the leader comes back. Ayatollah Khomeini becomes leader of this new regime in Iran. The Shah becomes ill with cancer at this point. The Iranians want him to die. However, the United States, we put him in there. He's our guy. We allow him to come to the Mayo Clinic for treatment. This infuriates the Iranians, increases anti-American sentiment there. So they overrun the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, or the capital, and capture 66 hostages and hold 52 hostages until January of 1981. Carter refuses to negotiate with terrorists and attempts a rescue operation. It's an embarrassment for the United States. It doesn't work. And so later on, we have some other things kind of take precedence over it. So the Shah finally dies. The U.S. or Iran is invaded by neighboring Iraq. The U.S. finally negotiates for the hostages to be released. And then minutes after President Reagan is sworn into office and Carter is no longer president, the hostages are released. They get a ticker tape parade in New York and free lifetime passes to any minor or major league baseball game. So that'd be kind of a nice perk. And then lastly, the changing society of the 1970s. More and more people are moving to the Sun Belt for their jobs there. A lot of immigrants are moving north there from Latin America and from Southeast Asia. So the Sun Belt is gaining more political power. A lot of our latter 20th century presidents come from there. I think Obama is the first one to break the trend coming from Illinois. Counterculture behaviors that were counter to mainstream beliefs have become more mainstream, such as premarital sex, divorce, and drug use. And the 1970s is known as the me decade because people are focusing on improving themselves through transcendental meditation and personal fitness. Lastly, conservatives continue to fight for traditional values, and they're going to start winning in 1980. Evangelical ministers start preaching to a broader audience using television. Some of those are Jerry Falwell, Oral Roberts, and Pat Robertson. They oppose the changes that have gone on in the 60s and 70s, like the Roe versus Wade abortion decision, the restrictions on school prayer in Engel versus Vitale, the drug use, and the premarital sex. But they do get one victory in Wisconsin versus Yoder. The Supreme Court decision upholds some religious freedom because it says the state cannot compel Amish children to attend school beyond 8th grade because it violates their religious beliefs. I know it was long. Thank you for staying with me. That is all I have for you, and I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.